In order to hate imperialism, you have to be a part of it.
Imperialism. What is it? Oxford Dictionary defines it as a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Throughout history, imperialism has been defined as forcing one nation's dominations over others in order to form an empire on a global scale, similar to what the British, French, Russian, and German empires did throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Surprising as it may be, though, imperialism benefits the few instead of the many. For example, the British Empire at its peak ruled 530 million people. However, the 30 million people that lived in the British Isles would be the only ones benefiting from this wealth. Orwell would often explain in his writings that imperialism was an excuse to be evil. As shown in his writings Burmese Days and Shooting an Elephant, those under it were forced to commit horrible actions just to suppress the native peoples of an area. For example, in Shooting an Elephant, the soldier shoots the elephant out of fear of being embarrassed, and then has to watch the elephant refuse to die no matter how many times he shoots it, similar to how in real life many of those forced to do imperialist actions are reluctant to go against their values for the sake of their country. For example, right now in Ukraine, many Russian soldiers are refusing to fight as they believe the war they are fighting is immoral. Although the root of imperialism had stemmed from actions in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it didn't stop there. Imperialism has continued, less blatant than before, but many of the more powerful nations today still continue to compete for control of land and territory, although not for humanitarian reasons, basically modern-day imperialism. A great example of this was the Cold War, where the Soviet Union and United States of America would fight both diplomatically and militarily in order to gain more control on the world stage to one-up the other. Beginning after the victory in World War II, the USA took up the role as the beacon of democracy and would fight anywhere it could to promote democracy and capitalism. After leading the assault that was responsible for liberating France from German control, Allied nations and their people saw America as liberators as well as a formidable military power. However, as the Americans liberated Western Europe, the Soviets liberated Eastern Europe and would soon set up their own governments that would lose any hint of democracy. This Western-Eastern European divide of power would lead to the Cold War, which was a perfect demonstration of imperialism's negative impacts on the world. These two countries would take part in battles on foreign soil to either preserve democracy or spread communism. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine stated that the United States had a moral obligation to help countries that require or ask for assistance in fighting against communist oppressors. The Soviets, on the other hand, would fund communist uprisings and would support the United States' enemies anywhere they could. This Cold War would never lead to war between the two countries, but lead to countless proxy conflicts and civil wars in order for one to gain the upper hand over the other. However, how does any of this apply to imperialism? Both nations throughout the Cold War claimed they were liberating or freeing nations from an oppressive rule, but this was just a ruse. In reality, these two nations fought in these proxy conflicts in order to expand their empire's control and influence across the world, both diplomatically and militarily. Basically the Oxford definition of imperialism. The suffering and destruction these two nations caused just to have more influence is astounding to think about. Sadly, although the Cold War ended in 1993 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States has never stopped this ideology of freeing nations they believed are corrupt or evil. Although they say they are fighting against these oppressive nations, in many situations they join these wars for the United States' economic interests, such as oil, as they have been seen doing in the Middle East many times before. This just reveals the blatant hypocrisy of America's founding ideals.
The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway.
America's foundation was built on fighting against oppression and tyranny in order to uphold liberty and democracy. Towards the late 1700s, America was still under British control, and colonists felt that their rule had turned into tyranny. In order to combat this, colonists led protests in an attempt to convince Britain to ease up on their taxes. However, this only escalated tensions between King George and the colonists. He sent troops over to America to bring back order and reinforce British control. Further conflicts between American colonists and British troops would ultimately lead to the Revolutionary War between Britain and America. This would finally end in America's independence. Since the foundation of the United States of America, its ideals and hopes have been for freedom, liberty, and justice for all. They broke free from the British control as they felt they were tyrants, and they had hoped that they would never again be ruled by a tyrant. In the Declaration of Independence, the document that officially declared them independent from the British, Thomas Jefferson wrote,
In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be ruler of a free people.
This is ironic considering what President Bush said about his invasion of Iraq. Although they started out fighting just for themselves like in the Revolutionary War, and stayed mostly in isolation for the majority of their history, over time it became clear that they were expanding their ideology across the world. The United States of America has fought in so many conflicts just to free the people there, yet in many cases there is no real reason to join these wars, joining only for their own self-interests. So why has this suddenly stopped now? Recently, the Russians have invaded Ukraine, saying they are trying to liberate the Ukrainian people from Nazi oppressors, and the democratically elected president of Ukraine is Jewish. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, refuses to acknowledge the Ukrainian people, saying Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He only acknowledges the Ukrainians as a former part of the Kievan Rus, a kingdom of the Slavic people that had Kiev as a capital, another reason for his war. Refusing to acknowledge the existence of older Ukrainian kingdoms like the Kingdom Ruthenia that outdated Russia's predecessor Muscovy. The Russians and Putin will spread whatever lies they want about their invasion, but it is clear the only reason Russians are involved in this war is for blatant imperialist reasons, as they know Ukraine joining NATO or becoming better friends with the West is a threat to them. The resulting conflict has come to be called the Russo-Ukrainian War, yet Russia has not been able to issue a formal declaration of war, calling it a special military operation. The Russians have joined the war in support of the Russian separatists, the DPR and LPR, within Ukraine who have been in open conflict with the Ukrainians since April 2014. Separatists wish they had been financially backing since they broke away from Ukraine. However, the legitimacy of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic is very questionable. Russia only began to back the separatists within Ukraine after the Maidan Revolution, an event that resulted in the pro-Russian government that had been around since 1991 being ousted, making Russia lose its control over Ukraine and leading the Russians to annex Crimea in 2014. Basically, since 2014, the Russian government has been doing anything it can to regain power over Ukraine, and recently with NATO becoming more and more friendly with the Ukrainians, they decided it was time to invade. The resulting invasion has been shocking on the world stage. The Russians, expecting little resistance from the Ukrainians, have now been bogged down in this war for nearly 3.5 months, with the Ukrainians even being able to push back Russian forces in many areas of their homeland. An unexpected feat considering the clear advantage the Russian army has over Ukraine in both equipment and manpower. Although they are halting this Russian advance militarily, the side effects across Europe are massive and are still developing as the war continues.
One massive effect of this war is the astounding refugee crisis, which is the largest in Europe since the Yugoslav wars. Currently, there are almost 7.1 million refugees sent across the European Union, and another 8 million Ukrainians are displaced within their own country. On top of the refugee crisis going on, there are civil rights issues for many of those trying to escape the war. Many of those trying to escape Ukraine that are of African descent reported being turned away, beaten, and sent to the back of their lines when they tried to enter Poland. Also, Indian refugees within Ukraine reported being targeted after their prime minister abstained from condemning Russia. The issues these minorities are facing are sickening and similar to what Americans have fought against since the civil rights movement. No matter how bad the refugee crisis or civil rights violations get, though, Russia is facing a much worse situation. The US and EU sanctions are destroying the Russian economy. Since enacted, the Russian ruble has lost 22% of its value and its inflation has risen 14%. Also, these sanctions are destroying Russia's oil industry, with almost every European country making plans to remove Russia from their imports or have already done so. The US and EU nations also removed major Russian banks from SWIFT, an international banking system that will now delay payments to Russia. Finally, the UK, EU, and the US have sanctioned more than 1,000 Russian businesses and individuals, destroying Russian oligarchs who could have helped Russia from abroad. It isn't just countries that are sanctioning Russia either. More than 1,000 international companies, including McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Starbucks, have either suspended trading with Russia or withdrawn altogether. Plus, the UK, EU, and the US have all been sending equipment and money to Ukraine in order to help their military and people hold out longer. All of these make the situation seem much easier for Ukraine to hold out. However, if Ukraine falls, the situation becomes much more serious for the rest of Europe. A potential full annexation of Ukraine would allow Russia a direct land border to 5 new countries and have control of more than half the Black Sea's coastline. This puts Russia in a very strong position to influence EU politics over the coming years and potentially re-annex former Soviet territories like Moldova. That isn't all either. Russia with Ukrainian territory would allow it over the next few decades to set up a heavy trade system within Europe, strengthening it as a European power and allowing it to exert power even further. Realizing this danger, more countries are rushing to NATO and the EU in hopes that they will be protected if Russia continues this aggressive action. Sweden and Finland have both established stronger ties with NATO, with the Finnish Prime Minister saying, "You caused this," to Russia. This war has had the opposite effect of what Russia originally wanted. They had hoped regaining Ukrainian territories would make NATO lose a potential member and strengthen their political position. Realizing the danger to their position in Europe, now they are threatening countries like Finland that are attempting to join NATO in a last-ditch effort to keep their enemies in Europe from growing stronger. Sadly, even though the Ukrainians have been able to resist the Russian invasion thus far, this won't last forever. Right now, the Ukrainians are dependent on support from NATO countries like the USA, who are supplying food, medicine, and weaponry so that they can continue their fight. However, if they are supporting Ukraine diplomatically and financially in this war, and the side effects of a Russian victory would be devastating, why aren't NATO nations joining this war?
Ukraine has always been a strong partner to the United States on international initiatives and a committed ally in fighting the war on terrorism.
Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States and Ukraine have enjoyed a diplomatic relationship as America helped Ukraine's transfer from the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic into a modern democratic state. In return, Ukraine has aided American efforts in the war on terror. It is safe to say that the United States and Ukraine are mutual military and political allies. However, with the continuation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. has done relatively little in coming to their aid. The only things the U.S. is doing of now is sending supplies and providing military training to Ukraine. This has definitely helped Ukraine even the playing field against Russia's superior military force, but it is unknown how long they will be able to stay ahead. However, this is almost exactly what America did during the Soviet-Afghan War. During this conflict, America supplied Afghan forces so that they would fight the Russians without America taking any risks. Two of the major reasons why the U.S. has remained relatively passive is because they do not want to start a massive global conflict and because Putin has already made nuclear threats against anyone who aids Ukraine. However, Putin is very unlikely to actually resort to nuclear weapons, as it would likely end in the destruction of both the US and Russia. As of now, it is more than 100 days into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and yet the Russians haven't been able to make serious gains. So maybe the unpredictability of the Russian regime is why they aren't joining the conflict, but yet again, if they don't draw the line somewhere, a system of appeasement similar to World War II may occur once again. So why is America not involved in this conflict? The answer is clear. This war doesn't benefit the U.S. financially, and there is no power to gain from this conflict, so the United States does not have a reason to get involved. America simply does not want to get into a conflict where they take large risks with minimal reward. A similar pattern has been happening since the middle of the 20th century. In Iraq, they got involved to ensure they still had control of the oil fields there. They say it's about the war on terror, but much of that reasoning is flawed if you think about the bigger picture. For the last few decades, the U.S. has only involved itself in conflicts where it benefits its own interests. They fought communism in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan in order to ensure more nations favored capitalism rather than communism. They fight in the war on terror in order to set up governments similar to the American system, removing governments that don't agree with American ideals. In Latin America, since the establishment of the Monroe Doctrine, they have launched coup d'etat after coup d'etat just to keep Latin American governments in support of American interests, just like the banana republics. This list goes on and on. America wants to play the role of protector of democracy, but they choose not to step into a conflict unless they will somehow benefit. If the risks of a conflict outweigh the reward, America will not get involved. It is possible that the U.S. is waiting for a combination of NATO sanctions and Ukrainian efforts to weaken the Russian military, ensuring an easy victory for a NATO invasion. America would then emerge from the conflict as a hero to the Ukrainian people and with more power on a global scale. However, as time passes, there is less and less hope that the American military will get involved directly in this conflict. On the other hand, the EU is establishing stronger connections with many European nations that once considered themselves neutral. This makes it very unlikely for another war like this to happen in the near future. However, unless this turns into a bigger conflict, the United States will continue treating this conflict as a proxy war.